Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am really excited to be here to announce the launch of the College Affordability Caucus. I co-founded this caucus with my colleagues, Representative Jahana Hayes from Connecticut and Representative Susie Lee from Nevada. And our goal is to create a forum for members of Congress to research, discuss, and develop solutions to the rising costs of college. We all know that for many Americans, a post-secondary education is the key to unlocking the door to stable employment, financial security, and economic mobility. But for most Americans, not just low-income Americans, for most Americans, the cost of college is a major barrier, and it can feel insurmountable, even to Americans in the middle and even the upper middle of the American earning spectrum. The College Affordability Caucus is going to foster discussions on how to maintain and indeed lower the cost of the tuition price tag, how to decrease the cost of living for students, and how to ultimately make sure that our next generation of students doesn't wind up with the educational debt crisis that we have today. To kick this all off, and we're going to have a continuing series of conversations, I want to lead a conversation today with our guest speaker, Caitlin Zaloom. And I want to start, though, by giving my colleagues who are co-chairs of this caucus, beginning with Representative Susie Lee, the opportunity to say a few words.
Great. Well, thank you, Katie. It's an honor, and I'm so happy you asked me to co-chair this caucus along with my dear friend and colleague, Jahana Hayes. Listen, this caucus, to me, there's no more important caucus, making sure that we are doing everything in our power to research and develop policy that will make college more affordable. You know, I think back to my college days. I'm one of 8 children. My dad earned $32,000. And the reason I know that was that I was able to fill out my FAFSA form by myself. I did not need additional help, which we know is a big issue right now. I went to Carnegie Mellon University. The cost of my tuition was $13,000, which I thought was astronomical. I just looked up what the cost of tuition at Carnegie Mellon today is. It's $57,000. So when you think about the buying power of a we were pure middle-class family. You think of the buying power of a middle-class family today versus, sorry, it was 31 years ago. I'm aging myself, but right now, $32,000 would be equivalent to about $68,000. So think about that. You know, it's 4.5 times is what the cost of an education at my alma mater has increased. And this is not just Carnegie Mellon, it's across the board. So not only, and then we've seen that along with a divestment of state governments in higher ed. And therefore the burden has been placed on our students and on their families. My brother has 5 kids. He just said, listen, my credit is destroyed because I took out loans and co-signed loans on behalf of my children and they were unable to pay it. So this is an issue that affects families all across this country, and something that we have to work to not just deal with the student debt crisis, deal with the college affordability crisis. And the student debt crisis to me is really a symptom of the bigger problem. And so I'm very excited. Caitlin Zaloom, thank you for all of your work and exposure to this issue through your book. It's an incredible book. And I'm just excited that to be here. And listen, in Nevada, in my own state, the average loan balance is $30,000, with over half of them saying that they cannot make a payment. And we know that this has completely gotten worse since the pandemic started. So we have 44.7 million Americans owing over $1.7 trillion in debt. So when we think about what we need to get our economy back on track, this is a big part of that conversation. So thank you again for having me. I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues. And I know we're going to make progress on this issue because our future depends on it.
Thank you so much, Representative Lee. And, I used to say to my grandparents all the time, I simply didn't have the same opportunities that they did. Or if I had the opportunity, it sure came with a different price tag and different implications for my life. My dad tells stories about flipping burgers during the summer and earning enough from that minimum wage job to pay his tuition at Iowa State University. Today, a student who worked full-time in a minimum wage job would be unlikely to be able to even live and support themselves in the summer, or even have enough left over to pay the cost of books. And so it is really, really a challenge for families today. And like Susie, I understand this personally. I took out over $100,000 in student loans for my undergrad and graduate education. I paid them off, and it took me about 11 years to do that. And I am one of the fortunate ones in that I was employed and able to pay them off. But I did have to take forbearance when I was between jobs. And I remember as I finished paying them off, I had a little bit of extra money from a tax refund. And I remember choosing, do I pay off my student loans, or do I put this in my son, my at that time, 4-year-old son's college savings plan? Because there's so much pressure on parents today to be able to save for the cost of college. But as Susie points out, if you're earning $32,000 a year to support a family, how are you ever going to save the cost of college tuition? It's simply impossible. So this pressure that we put on parents to save when the cost of college make that virtually impossible, or a big part of this. We all know about the student loan debt burden, education debt. And one of the reasons we founded this caucus was to recognize that whatever solutions we come up with for educational debt, we have to solve the problem going forward. It's not just about the debt that is burdening our economy today. It's about what are we going to burden families with tomorrow as they seek an education. So we need to figure out what are the hidden costs of families, what's driving up the cost of tuition, what's driving up the total cost of college. And so I'm thrilled to have Caitlin Zaloom joining us. She is a cultural anthropologist and professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University. And her latest book, Indebted: How Families Make College Work at Any Cost, explores how the financial pressures of paying for college hurts middle-class families. She's also the editor-in-chief of the magazine Public Books, and her research has been supported by a wonderful array of institutions, including the Russell Sage Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and Stanford University's Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. You can find out more about Caitlin and read more about her in a number of publications, including the New York Times and the Atlantic. But thank you so much, Caitlin, for being with us. And we're looking forward to learning from you. I think one of the things Susie and I would both say is Congress sometimes jumps to solutions without really understanding the best possibilities, because you have to study the problem to study the solution. And I think sometimes politicians are too eager to announce problem solved without really understanding what is the problem. So we're really excited to have you present.
All right, well, thank you so much, Representative Porter and Representative Lee. I'm really delighted to be here and to get to talk to you about the research that I did for Indebted and the pressures that families face in sending young adults to and through college. I think that all of us have a kind of classic image of what college graduation looks like in our minds. Students standing together in black robes, tossing mortarboards upwards into a cloudless blue sky. And that image sums up the essentials of what middle-class adulthood are supposed to be about, right? Achievement and equality and freedom. And that is what parents want to give their children when they prepare them for college. But we are very far from that today. Because the cost is so high, college now means wrestling with a looming expense and the debt it will require in ways that have changed the very definition of what it means to be middle class. Living a middle class life used to mean being confident And that is no longer the case. Today, it means being insecure and uncertain about what the future holds. And the cost of college lies at the heart of that change. Families face payments that they can't cover without undue stress. So instead of being the great leveler, college now induces social shame and reinforces inequality. Those are some fundamental facts that I learned from researching my book, Indebted. I based Indebted on a study of more than 160 in-depth interviews with four-year college students and their families. None of these were eligible for a Pell Grant, and they all carried debt to support higher education. We discussed the financial challenges of college and how this shaped their family lives. And we also talked about what they wanted from education and what they believed the cost of achieving this would mean for their futures. These interviews elicited families' point of view on higher education. And that is an approach that's very different from the standard economic one, which tends to focus on individual students and looks at college as a financial investment. That framework is far too narrow on its own. College means much more to families and students than the potential income benefits. In fact, I found that the problem of paying for college creates traps for middle-class families that are as much moral as they are financial. So I want to describe some dimensions of those traps. The problems from the economic side should be no surprise. On average, the cost of attendance for a single young adult at a four-year state college or university is about $25,000 per year and about $50,000 per year at a private one. And for reference, the median household income before the pandemic was $69,000 a year. And of course, most families have more than one child. But from their earliest days together, families learn a few key lessons about college. The first is that they will have to pay and pay high sums for higher education. That has not always been the case. Our university systems were once either free or extremely low cost. And now middle-class families know they will have to pay so much that they should start worrying about it years and sometimes even decades in advance. Parents get this message loud and clear from the prices of college and also from the very programs that are supposed to help them pay. Higher education policies instruct their users in how to be good parents, students, and citizens. I want to give an example about that. Take the 529 plans, which inform parents that they should be saving for college, even though most cannot and do not. And the student lending system, which teaches that income alone will not cover the expense of getting a young adult to and through college. Forget that minimum wage summer job. Instead, families learn that they will have to go into debt, and that will take a decade or more to pay off. Together, programs like these tell families that they should be solving the problem of the high cost of college education on their own. They cannot. The financial piece is only one part of these traps, though. Parents are also deeply committed to providing opportunities for their children to fully develop their potential. This begins in the earliest years of a child's life. In addition to the demand to save and invest for college years out, parents feel immediate pressure to set their children up for success. That means attending strong schools from the very beginning and paying a high mortgage or rent to give access to them. The cost hardly ends with housing in schools too. Parents often feel they should pay for sports or music lessons or for tutors to help where the schools cannot. Or they don't spend, and they face the fear that their children will suffer disadvantage. This conflict between saving up and providing a good life for their kids defines the early years of middle-class family life. Another part of the trap opens at the moment when parents and young adults are deciding where to enroll. They know that they will be making tough choices when deciding on a school and what students will study while they are there. Policy offerings from federal student loans to the Department of Education's college scorecard broadcast the message that college should be considered primarily in financial terms. Parents and students should ask first and foremost how much it will cost and how much young adults will make when they graduate. We all know that education is for much more than this. Families understand the financial cost, but they also carry another value. Among all the things that middle-class families consider when choosing a college, none was so important as which institution would best support their young adults' development. That, although it is, of course, about preparing for work life, parents and students alike described this as the essential reason for pursuing higher education. And this is very much in line with the vision of many educators, reaching all the way back to John Dewey. Dewey argued that education is critical not because it might enable a high income, but because it is the means of students' self-cultivation. Education should be for studying in environments where young people are encouraged to experiment, both on their own and with their peers. The freedom to develop their potential fully is the foundation of an empowered democratic citizenry. Today, a college degree is the most reliable way to give young people a chance to live their lives as they see fit. My research shows that families feel a responsibility to prepare young adults for that future and that they will pay dearly for it. A higher education system that honors their values would alleviate the burden of today's high costs and ensure that young people have the right to make their own futures and our countries with it. Thank you. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so very much. That's incredible. We're getting a couple questions in the question and answer feature, and we encourage people to continue to type those in. We're happy to take audience questions, so please put them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to ask them. I was really taken by your comment about the pressure that families feel communicated through policy that they should be able to somehow pay for college themselves. And this concept of, the 529, and if only you had more discipline to save. But one of the things that, I think when you look at people's incomes and you think, even if they were saving 5% of their income, which would be a huge figure, they wouldn't have enough when it came time for their kids to go to college. And I think that transferring of problems onto individuals, when in fact education is a collective investment. I don't want Susie's kids to go to college because they're my kids. I want Susie's kids to go to college because they're going to be great contributors to our economy and help keep our country strong. So I think that's a really important point. One of the things that you mentioned was sort of how people struggle to repay this and the burden that it creates on families. Can you say a little bit about what it's meant for us to move the student aid window, the repayment window? When I went to college, it was a big idea that you would suffer under education debt for 10 years. And when I was 20, that just seemed like, oh my God, by the time I'm 30. And now, so many of our students are in repayment plans that are 20 years and even 30 years. And this is actually parallels something we've seen, which is more people carrying more kinds of debt, whether it's mortgage debt or education debt later into life. Can you talk a little bit about, that's a strategy we've tried to use to make college more affordable, which is give you more years to pay. But isn't it also compounding some of those anxieties that you talked about and financial problems that you talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this issue of the burden that repayment puts on families and on young adults is really, really critical. And for me, it comes down to the fundamental problem that paying for college today is incredibly unpredictable. So for a student that is in college today, their parents would not have actually been able to predict what it would cost. So even if they had been able to put aside enough money to pay, they wouldn't have actually known how much money that would be. I mean, it's utterly unpredictable how much college is going to cost a family. It might even be unpredictable to a family who is enrolling. Those costs can change even while their students are in college. And then on the way, after graduation, on the way out of higher education, the question of how long that cost will burden students and their families. I mean, it can stretch for, as you were saying, between 10 years and 30 years, depending on the repayment program. And also depending on the repayment program, it will shift how much that education actually costs because of compounding interest. So the fact that the cost of college is so unpredictable makes planning next to impossible, and then extends the burden of college well into adult life for young adults and well into adulthood, almost to retirement for their parents sometimes too.
Is there any reason, I mean, as we think, because that's a very real phenomenon, and I think most families experience, they get the most aid in the first year when they are competing to get students to attend with other universities. And then that aid tends to dwindle. And, on the one hand, as a student approaches graduation and they're going to earn their degree, their potential to repayment does improve. But on the other hand, like you said, why should the cost, why should there be that instability? And is that certainty something that Congress should tackle? And this reminds me a little bit of some of the conversations that we had when we were thinking about regulating credit cards, which is, why should the price you borrow, why should the price change after you start? And so is there any reason that we can't, what are the barriers to creating kind of offering a 4-year financial aid package right at the inception to students? Is there a reason that we shouldn't be pushing for that? Even if they had to, if things change, we can adjust. But the changes should be on the family's end, not on the end of these institutions, which have a lot of stability from year to year. So what do you think of that idea? Like, you get the 4-year package for costs.
Yeah, well, I think that would be for sure a positive step. And the issue about where stability is possible is really essential, because it is true that inside the colleges and universities, and also in the aid packages, in the funding and financial aid system, we should be able to offer stability and predictability. That is very, very important. Because without stability, it becomes impossible for families to really understand what they should be doing in order to make the future work for them. With some predictability, it's much, much easier.
Wonderful. I want to make sure to introduce Representative Jahana Hayes, the co-founder of the College Affordability Caucus. Jahana, I have to go question in an oversight hearing. So if you don't mind, you can make some introductory remarks or continue to listen to Caitlin. And my staffer, Jessica's on to help facilitate questions, but I'll be right back.
No, thank you so much. And I'm so excited to be a part of relaunching the College Affordability Caucus. There's so much more work that we have to do. And I think between my input on the Ed and Labor Committee and Representative Porter on financial services, we can really elevate these critical conversations that have kind of been outliers and not central to the discussion. I'm passionate about education, but I also recognize that for many people, it's an impossible choice. And that should not happen in this country. Everyone should have access to affordable, high quality education and not be burdened with debt. And I am amongst friends in this conversation, but we are actually in a position to legislate and make those necessary changes to ensure that, our children, their children, and even the people who have already graduated and hold degrees, or many who do not hold degrees, don't have this added complex burden of managing the debt associated with it. It really creates just an unfair opportunity gap. It disproportionately affects people of color, low-income families, first-generation college students who really don't have the financial literacy to make those decisions. Myself, I just knew I wanted an education. So whatever they gave me to sign, I signed it because I just wanted it that badly. And I think that we have to put guardrails in to protect people like me, people like my students who just want to do better. And every indicator says education is the pathway to success. So you have people who say, I want to be a contributing member of society. I want to be successful. I want to change the trajectory of my family. And the information that we're giving them is the only way, or the best way to do that is through a high quality education. And for most people, there is no set aside. There is no college fund. It is, you tell me what I need to do to get to there, and I'm willing to do that. So thank you for joining us and partnering in this very important work. And I look forward to hearing the rest of this discussion.
Okay, thank you, Representative Hayes. Jessica, I don't know if you want to continue with questions, or if I just should respond to that.
If you'd like to respond to Rep. Hayes, and I know the next question that Congresswoman Porter was going to ask was about kind of rebuilding a new system that genuinely supports families and creates more opportunities, and what that system might look like.
Okay. Well, so the first thing that I wanted to address from what Representative Hayes just said was the way that families are encouraged to have their young people get an education, and that this is the best way forward. But then, in fact, so much of the financial system, the student finance system that they're thrust into, tells them that then they have, in one way or another, failed. They have failed to be able to support their young adult in getting that education. And one of the things that I'm really thinking about here is the expected family contribution. And so in my research with families, we talked about what that moment was like when they got the expected family contribution. And the message that I got overwhelmingly was that the number that it produced felt arbitrary and punitive. They did not feel like their real responsibilities had been assessed fairly. And this is perhaps not, it shouldn't come as such a surprise, because the measurement of families, financial strength, that's the term, that's the formal term, is based on a notion of what families look like and what their responsibilities are that is really, really outdated. It assumes that families are mostly nuclear, 2 parents and 2 kids living at home under one roof. And it doesn't, in fact, take into account and payments that they might make to grandparents or to cousins or to chosen kin. It really looks at a nuclear family that no longer exists. And of course, there are carve-outs, there are like little tweaks here and there for adjustments. But the issue is that this outdated version of what a family is baked into the measurement of financial aid, and that is really, really a problem.
I just want to jump back in just to follow up on what you just said, because you said something very important. Because for many of my students, I can remember that the alternative when the funding fell short was to take out a PLUS or a parent loan. And they said, my parents would never qualify for this loan. So there was this expectation that once you filled out the FAFSA and all of your everything, all other avenues were exhausted, that then your parents could, have the credit rating to be able to co-sign for that loan. Or so many of my students who had 2 parents that were not married, were not together, and there was a requirement that they collect all of the financial information from a parent who was not a contributor in their life. So I had so many students who could not access those documents, were in a situation where their parents were not legally their primary guardians, but because they were their parents, the system says you have a mother and a father, we need all of the financial documentation in order for you to qualify for this funding. So again, it would disproportionately, whether intentional or unintentionally, cut out a large group of kids from just a widespread of demographics and make it just present additional barriers to financing an education.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I would add too that it's the families that are that don't conform to this neat and unrealistic expectation that are that are punishing that we are punishing, right? So so it is actually, I think, completely predictable that students who come from families that don't conform to this narrow, outdated definition would be punished by that very system. And we need to make sure that they have a way to access aid that doesn't require them to pretend like they have two parents neatly living at home that share all their financial information without barriers. We send so many messages through the kinds of policies that we that we offer to families. And this policy says, if you don't conform to this image of family life, there's something wrong with you, and we're going to punish you on the financial front too. Jessica, can you remind me what the next question on Representative Porter's list was?
Absolutely. So I think we've kind of covered a little bit of this, but she wanted to talk about how we need a new system, which you've talked about before, that kind of genuinely supports families and creates those opportunities, and what policymakers should be keeping in mind as we design policies to better support our families.
Yeah. I think that the thing that is the most critical is to start to reconsider how higher education contributes to our collective future together. So over the last 40 years, we have learned that, or we've been taught that higher education is mainly a benefit to students and their families that can be measured in a higher income. This is a far, far too narrow idea about what education is for. And it's a far too narrow idea about what education does for all of us. We need to be thinking about education as a public good. And I think that there has been no greater instruction in this than the pandemic. We need educated people who are teachers. We need educated people who are nurses. We need educated people who are administrators. And we need to understand what our interconnections are. So that means that that education needs to be considered a public good, even over and above any sort of benefit of potential income that it might bring to individuals. So I think that it's really quite important to reframe it that way. It's also really important, if we're going to consider education a public good, that we create opportunities for students to attend across all their differences. Universities should be places where students can come and discover the richness of the United States and not have to worry about whether or not they can pay, because how we ask students to pay has a very strong impact on how they consider education, what they think they should study, and what they think they can do on the way out.
And how do you see the effects of COVID-19 increasing the hardships caused by student loan debt? And how do you see it increasing the difficulties of financing higher education for middle-class families?
Well, I think that COVID-19 has just accelerated everything that was already a problem. So I don't think that we're going to see a difference in kind so much as just exacerbated inequality and really the problems of instability and unpredictability that families already faced are now much, much worse, because of course young people don't know what kinds of jobs are going to be available. They don't know what the future is going to look like at all. And so the pressures of student debt and the demand to repay is going to feel like even more of a burden on families and students.
I think you brought up a very interesting point, because I think that what we may see is some reluctance by parents to obligate themselves with additional debt, which in turn would bar students from, or perhaps make them hold off on attending. You know, I've seen so many parents who have made the sacrifice to take out a PLUS loan, or to, you know, work within those parameters of the expected family contribution. But when they're tightening the belt on everything else, I could really see the potential for parents not wanting to co-sign a loan, or put it off for another semester, or perhaps not let their children live on campus as a way to cut the costs, and really just limit their experience in ways that, but for the fact that they're cost prohibitive, would not have even been a part of the conversation. I also think, I mean, I guess it's twofold, because another thing that I saw from students in the classroom is there was only one pathway. You know, you applied for financial aid using your parents' income information. I've seen where college was more important to the child than it was to the parent, where parents thought, this is not a good use of talent, this is not a good use of money, and therefore did not participate in the process. And I remember I had one student in particular, you know, culturally, her parents didn't think that their daughter should aspire to this higher education, so therefore did not participate in the process, did not share documentation. So we have to look at multiple pathways, not this singular vision, like you said, of a nuclear family that relies on checking all these boxes in order to access higher education. So I would be interested to hear your thoughts on just alternative perspectives or viewpoints for engaging in these types of financial decisions.
Yeah, well, I think that in addition to the assumption that that families are these kind of neat nuclear units, the student financing system that we have has lots of basically middle class assumptions built into them, and I think that is what you're talking about too, Representative Hayes. It's that there's an idea that there's a family that already understands the educational system, feels comfortable inside it, aspires within it, and that there is a kind of unitary force behind students to achieve in that particular way. And we've kind of locked that in by forcing families to be part of the financing system. That is really different than systems that focus on making college affordable for the student themselves. And so this is, I think, something that is really, really important. It's very, very important to me to be able to think about having college be affordable to the person who is being educated. I mean, you know, preferably free. I mean, one thing that is always very like both predictable and close to my heart is that whenever I talk about my book, there will be a like a grandma from California who stands up and says, you know, like, I walked into, you know, I mean, I went to UC Berkeley, so often it's UC Berkeley, and paid my $50 and graduated with a 4-year degree. I think that is the kind of vision that we should have. And it turns out that that those California grandmas think so too.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that, you know, I think one of the biggest myths that sometimes people deal with in this area, including elected officials, is that education debt and the cost of college are a young people's issue. And actually, some of the most vigorous committed advocates for reducing the sticker price of college are actually those Californians in their 60s and 70s and 80s, and other people, like I mentioned, my dad and others, who remember when this was possible. And I think one of the things we're in danger of is we have to activate that generation to fight for this politically and make sure that we're not transferring this onto young people or allowing this to be isolated as a one generation issue. And so I think you're absolutely right that some of the very biggest champions I have in my 45th congressional district for free college are the older people who have lived it, who have seen it, and they don't accept the excuses that it can never be done, that it could never happen, because they saw it being done. Jahana, I don't know if you had another immediate question, but I wanted to ask a little bit about, to your point about the person being educated ought to be able to cover the costs. I think that's a really important point. And one of the things with the FAFSA is that it's all about gathering information from your parents, from your family. And for people who are in divorced families or split families, for people who, it can be an incredibly painful and upsetting experience. Talk to me about, what are the harms of the FAFSA in terms of the time, the way that it's impossible for people to navigate. I think about how can someone who's working 2 jobs find 10 hours to try to navigate the FAFSA. And Congress did pass legislation last Congress to reduce the number of FAFSA questions from 108 to 36. But you highlight a lot of other issues with FAFSA, and I wanted to know if you could share a little more about that.
Yes. So we talked a little bit about many of the outdated assumptions that go into the FAFSA, but I think that it all comes down to the idea that families should be paying for college because the benefit of an education is a private good. It is like an asset, like a mortgage, rather than looking at education in a broader fashion as a public good that will in fact benefit us all. And I think that's really, really important I was of course encouraged to see the number of questions on the FAFSA get shrunk, because it is a kind of terrifying event for a lot of families and students to actually have to face the FAFSA. I also think that there's a really critical issue with the FAFSA, which again is is one that has to do with the social class of the people who face it. That being confronted with a complex form like the FAFSA, even in the reduced number of questions, assumes a kind of comfort with government intrusion into your life and measurement of your family's critical details. Like what's in your savings account, how much do you make, how many kids do you have, you have to report all of these things on the FAFSA, and it goes into great detail even in this revised form. Now, many of the middle class families that I talked to for indebted didn't necessarily think of the FAFSA as being too much of an event, but that comes because they are already comfortable with bureaucratic processes, right? They live them. They work in big organizations. They have jobs, but the FAFSA itself can be a barrier for students and families who wouldn't necessarily otherwise go to college. So the fact of it, is a barrier that we should really be reckoning with.
Absolutely. Jahana, did you have another question?
No, actually, the question that you asked is, we were doing a deep dive into just that families are different, the structure is different, and these outdated assumptions create additional barriers for access to higher education. So I really think that at the core of our work, that really is, what we're trying to illuminate, just that families are different, everyone accesses information differently, and we have to account for all of those factors when we are presenting education as an option. And so many people, it just becomes overwhelming. It just becomes overwhelming. And if you are a first generation college student or someone from a family who values education but just doesn't know how to navigate it, sometimes the easier option is just to turn your back and walk away. So really not just creating multiple pathways to access that education, I think is what is very important, and recognizing that it does not look the same for everyone.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you, Caitlin, a little bit about, you talked about the costs of tuition. We had Susie Lee on giving an example from her institution, Carnegie Mellon, but one of the things I hear so much from University of California students, where California has tried to maintain their tuition while their level of public support has eroded. It's obviously not $50 anymore. It's 16 or 17,000 in tuition. We have tried, but the cost of room and board and those ancillary costs, some of which are somewhat hidden. We have epidemics of food insecurity and homelessness, people living in their cars on campus. What is driving all of that, and how should we think about that as something that is somehow the responsibility of the student to deal with? I think we used to have this concept that room and board was part and parcel of going to college.
Yeah. Well, of course, a person has to live, right? And that brings in a real conflict with education, because you also have to study, right? So you can't be working the whole time to try to make ends meet while also studying. These two things are at odds with each other, and the system that we have right now, asking students and families to pay so much money, makes it almost impossible to really devote enough time to doing the thing that college is supposed to do, which is to enable students to get an education. So the fact that students have to work so much and across their 4 years really takes away from the ability to focus on the core work of studying and learning and exploring in ways that will help young adults develop. And I wanted to add too something else, because our system for paying for college really changes what education means, and from really like the earliest days too. So when we ask students and families to pay so much, it makes them think about education as primarily an economic endeavor, right? It makes them ask, well, what should I study if I'm going to pay off this debt when I graduate, right? So it actually, instead of allowing students to go into their educations and to try to explore their talents and what they believe they're good at, it asks them to consider studying in fields that are going to allow them to pay. That fundamentally changes the educational experience. And I think that is not something that we should be laying onto students and their families. That is not what they value education for, and it is something that we should enable the values that students and families have together.
And I think that's cycle. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
I said, I just want to add to the point you just made, that when you have students who have to work or do work study in order to contribute to their education, it just exacerbates those equity gaps, because then you have students whose families are able to make those contributions that can get involved in campus life and get involved in service projects and really focus more 100% of their attention on studying. So the students who have to work in order to get an education, there's a true equity gap there, because their attention is divided. Their work is divided. And also their extracurricular activities are limited. There are so many students who cannot, join clubs and get the full experience of networking on a college campus, because when they are not in class, they are working.
I think one of the I did work study all the way through my college. I had probably 7 or 8 jobs. I put barcodes on books in the basement of the library. I was a courier for one of the deans. I did all different kinds of things. But I think the model, if we think work study is valuable, and we think there's something to giving kids having the opportunity as part of your education to work, to have that balance between work and study, then that ought to be how we structure it for everybody. So to Jahana's point, if work study is something that has some value, then it ought to be valuable for every single student. And it ought to be part of college, that when you get past your, you're going to have this part-time job in your sophomore year, all sophomores work 10 hours a week or whatever it is. The fact that we use work study to some students who are being asked to pay and do this work and others are not, I think is one of the really unfair pieces of the system. So I thank Jahana for pointing that out. And I personally enjoyed my work study jobs, but I also noticed that a lot of my colleagues didn't have to do them. And I would be extra tired and up extra late and working extra hard to try to get the same grade because I was tired after working my 7 or 8 hours a day of sometimes of work study. So really appreciate that support. In the book, you talk about public reinvestment in higher education and specifically state support. And I wanted you to ask, just to educate us a little bit, has state support dwindled? And has it dwindled in everywhere? And because one of the things I sometimes hear is, well, they're putting in the same amount of money. They used to contribute, let's say, X dollars. They're still contributing X dollars, but meanwhile, tuition has gone up threefold. Is that right, or are they contributing fewer dollars?
In terms of the public university systems in the country, I mean, almost across the board, there are way fewer dollars being contributed to higher education. So recently there have been some efforts, in like in New York with the Excelsior program, for instance, or the governor's effort in New Mexico to make higher education free for New Mexico citizens, that are perhaps starting to turn the boat a little bit. I mean, the Excelsior program has been a bit of a mess, but at least it is an attempt to say we understand that New Yorkers need access to higher education at a free or low cost. I mean, in fact, that is a return to what we used to have. My own stepfather went to CUNY. He was a poor kid from the Bronx. And went to the City University of New York for free, and was from a family like Representative Hayes described, where he didn't get any help from his parents. They didn't even think it was worth him going to college. So this is at least a bit of a return, but almost across the board, there have been double-digit declines in the amount of money that states have been spending on higher education. And in fact, that decline started like so many decades ago, it's like a little hard to believe, like from the 1970s forward, and with acceleration after 2000 and then again after 2008.
Representative Hayes, did you have a question? And
No.
we're nearing the end of our time, so I want to make sure
this was
that
a great discussion. I think that outside of just the contribution of the families, I think some other things that we really need to take a closer look at is, what is the money being used for? On my committees, oftentimes there's discussion about students are taking out more loans than they need to finance their education. However, I recognize from being a student, talking to students, that oftentimes it is taking care of other things so that they have the ability to stay in class. You have students using their tuition money to pay rent in an off-campus apartment, to keep their car on the road, to pay insurance, all of those intangibles that are not directly related to their education, but there's a but for the fact that those things are taken care of, they can't access that education. So this is not just paying the tuition and getting students in seats ready to learn. It is about creating an environment where all of those other barriers have been eliminated so that they can sit in the seat and be ready to learn. And I think that also has to be a part of the larger conversation, because affording education is not just about paying the tuition. It's about setting yourself up in a place where, like teachers would say, you're in the class ready to learn. And for so many people, that's going to look different, whether it be accessing childcare, whether it be having reliable transportation, whether it be, you know, making sure that so many of the schools that I visit have had on-campus food pantries, you know, where students are saying they didn't want to take out the meal plan because it was too expensive, but they don't want to have to finance that, but they need to eat while they're on the campus. So, you know, there's so many other factors to consider. So I'm really just incredibly optimistic about the work of this caucus moving forward and just tackling all of these things and looking at where we can make legislative fixes so that these barriers are removed for so many of our students. And you were great. This was a really great conversation, and you've been at this for a while. There's a lot of in-depth information, and it's great to hear you articulate the things that I know for sure and that I've seen, but to put the research and the data behind it just solidifies the point. So thank you so much for your incredible work on this issue.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Representative.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and it's wonderful to have you here. And for those of you who haven't read Indebted, I highly recommend it. And some of the heartbreaking stories that you share in the book that really stay with people to understand beyond what we often think about with, you know, bureaucracy and administrative decisions and decisions at the level of millions and billions. We see families in your book you know, struggling because they can't pay the $200 to get the textbook that they need to pass the class and to complete the class. So thank you very much for being part of this
Or to
conversation.
release a transcript. You don't know how many times I saw that. They can't afford to pay to release a transcript.
Yep.
So for so many people, they're re-entering already in the negative.
Yep, absolutely. And so really appreciate your flagging this for us. We're going to be in touch. And we want to encourage everybody who participated today. We're planning upcoming events, and we look forward to continuing this conversation, really with the goal of understanding what do we have to do to bring down the sticker price of college, of education, not just of tuition, but of getting an education to be something that is in the reach of the majority of American families rather than the minority. And we have, as you pointed out, 30 or 40 years of policy going the opposite direction. So we're dedicated to doing this work. And I want to thank Representative Susie Lee, who was with us earlier, and Representative Jahana Hayes for being the co-leads here and hosting this event and launching this College Affordability Caucus. Thank you so much, everyone.